We're joined now by Seamus O'Reilly, who writes for the Irish Times and also happens to be the world's foremost authority on the literary works of Steve Bruce. How did your interest in these works of high art develop?
Well, I've always had a passion for really, really terrible books. And I heard a little bit of whispers about them. One of them fell into my lap last February, I think, and pretty much read it in like two goes. They're not very long, and yeah, I've been much addicted. But after that, the main problem was just that they were very, very rare. I don't know if they've been suppressed, perhaps by the publisher or by Steve himself, but they were pretty hard to get hold of. So that was the next battle, was actually getting the next two.
Can you describe? They all seem to be based around the adventures of a central character. Can you describe this main character, Steve Barnes, and does he resemble anyone in real life?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we have a crack team of people going through, seeing if we get any hints. Now, the current operating premise is that it's actually kind of like an author surrogate for Steve Bruce himself. So his name is Steve Barnes. If you think about it, it's kind of a little bit like Steve Bruce. He also manages Lettersford Town, sometimes called Lettersfield Town because why not? And
So
he
the name of the team
Steve,
actually changes
yeah,
from sentence to sentence.
it does, yeah.
Okay.
It does. Basically, on the back of the actual book, it says Lettersfield. On the front of and in the context of the books, it says Lettersford. There are characters whose names change, yeah, in the middle of a page. Yeah, so that is the kind of level of detail. So it is surprising that they have such sort of complex, highfalutin literary devices as sort of author surrogates. He also has team surrogates. So, for example, he manages Lettersford Town when he was actually in real life managing Huddersfield Town. He talks about his glory days at Mulcaster United, which we're going to go right ahead and presume is Manchester United. But he also, the weird thing about that is sort of a Roy of the Rovers kind of thing of, Melchester, or you kind of make up a fictional place. You kind of think maybe it's because he doesn't want to step on the toes of people he's talked to. But he still mentions all those other people. So he still mentions Manchester United. He still mentions Alex Ferguson or walking around outside Old Trafford. But he also talks about Mulcaster. So he's kind of overpopulating this fake sort of universe of fictional teams, which I kind of described as a crap Westeros filled with, with pies and fags.
Does he have any? In this portrait of Alex Ferguson, I mean, is there a thinly disguised kind of managerial titan at Mulcaster United?
Do you know what? He doesn't actually mention he does say his former manager at Mulcaster, but then he also separately in the book talks about Alex Ferguson just as Alex Ferguson. He'll say, hey, you don't have to be Alex Ferguson to work that one out, that kind of stuff. Okay. So it's slightly muddled. It's like he's kind of he's perhaps he's understood some of the grammar of a book, the sort of structure, but none of it really kind of holds together coherently because, yeah, as I say, he will go to the great lengths of talking about, say, for example, all these fake places and fake names, but he mentions all the real versions as well. So you don't know what kind of weird swollen British Isles it is that he's describing.
Sorry, what are the preoccupations of Steve Barnes? I mean, what drives him?
What makes him tick?
Well, it's he does like to get embroiled in things which are maybe slightly beyond his station. So he's a football man. He's plain bred. He loves to tell you about what breakfast he's had. In the latest book, he goes to Brazil, and I think he mentions what he eats every single day. In fact, every single meal when he's there. He loves describing what he's eating. He also has a bit of a habit of getting mixed up in murders. Not himself personally, but sometimes he's accused. Sometimes he is involved in something which is a suspicious death, which turns out to be a murder. In the first book, his star striker, an Irishman named Duffy, I believe, is stabbed in the changing room, and so he's kind of embroiled in this. How did this happen on your patch? Some people in the press are actually saying that maybe he did it. So his basic thing is to kind of, despite the fact he hasn't got the training, the wherewithal, the time, or anything like the resources to be a homicide detective, he takes it upon himself to be the world's worst homicide detective.
Well, I don't understand. I mean, why don't the police take charge of the investigation?
That's a very, very good question, especially because they are present and they do come in, and they actually also tell him not to get involved. And also, Barnes himself consistently says throughout, "I would never make a good homicide detective." And then there's just another 20 pages of him being, actually living up to that by being a really bad homicide detective. In the second book, for example, he is embroiled in. It's probably the magnum opus, I think, of the three books. If it's not bad for me to play favorites, in that one, the sort of very brief 20-second version of the plot is a caretaker, the sweeper of the title. It's a sort of a very clever pun. Again, he's quite.
You think it's going to be a sort of central defensive player, but actually it's the ground.
No, I mean that's quite horribly literal of you. He's actually working on a slightly higher level. He's gone for the pun there. So there's a janitor, shall we say, a sort of a caretaker at the club. He goes down. He's dead, and it turns out that he may or may not have been a sort of a Yugoslavian war criminal who is being hunted both by the British Secret Service and by sort of Nazi hunting Mossad agents from Israel. All of this is delivered with the sort of tact you would imagine from a current manager, former player, who is, for some reason, spending 3 weeks of the year 1999 to 2000 writing three very brisk, very strange murder mysteries.
He wrote them all in one 3-week burst of creativity.
It would appear that that's the case. So, I mean, the current operating principle is, or the premise is that he sat down with a guy from Paragon Press Publishing. I've got to imagine that there was, a little bit of ghostwriting involved, but I'm sure more details of that will shake out now that we've blown the case wide open in typical Steve Barnes style. But he sat down and did them in a very, very short space of time. And one thing that I have kind of pulled apart in the last review was that one of the sort of maybe slightly ironic things is that at this exact moment, whenever he started putting these out or doing this whole process, Huddersfield were actually doing really, really well. I mean, they were in the conversation for promotion. They were in the top 4, top 6, and pretty much exactly when he started bringing the books out, there was a definite slalom to the point where they were sort of mid-table finishers in the second tier, to the point where actually the following October, about 3 or 4 months after the last book was released, he was sort of unceremoniously sacked. So it's almost as if Steve Barnes' own
Leeds United on trial.
What's that, sorry?
Dave O'Leary's book, a similarly ill-starred book that he brought out just as Leeds were doing really well, and it all just fell apart.
Was his a murder mystery as well?
No, it was a courtroom drama. Based on real
events.
Really? Well, it was a courtroom drama based on the trial of 2 of his own players, which may have contributed to the fact that it didn't go down that well in the dressing room.
Seamus, has Bruce talked much about this brief interlude in his career where he writes these kind of nutty football crime novels? Has he explained what he was trying to do, why he did it?
He's not actually gone into too much detail about it. He has been asked about it once or twice. I think they've kind of been sort of like samizdat that have been passed around from, sort of football journalists and sarcastic types who don't appreciate the full majesty of them, as I do as a serious academic, obviously. But they've been a kind of a running joke, I'd say. It's fair to say. And they've been brought up a few times. There was a Daily Mail or some sort of local press. There's a few little interviews where it's mentioned. And he's very self-deprecating. And he says, I don't know what I was thinking just because I've got one GCSE in English. Now, I knew that he had a GCSE in English because Steve Barnes, the narrator of these books, mentions it, I think, 8 or 9 times in the first book. But he mentions it mostly as a good thing. He's like, I've got a fancy, GCSE in English. He keeps mentioning it. And probably the best example of this is when he says 2 star-crossed lovers. It just uses it in conversation to refer to 2 characters, and his secretary is so impressed that he has to say, look, Julie, his secretary, his long-suffering secretary, I would say, is from Romeo and Juliet. She says, you never cease to surprise me. I mean, it is probably the most famous play of all time, but
it's one thing that kind of strikes me when you think about this is why more people haven't attempted to set popular fiction in the world of football, given that it is a world in which so many millions of people spend much of their sort of mental time. I mean, my dad is always on at me, you know, why don't you write a book about, imagine the England football team is kidnapped and they're on the way to the World Cup and the plane is taken to Iran. You kick it off from there, why don't you? And I suppose I don't really know the answer to why I haven't done it. But I mean, it seems like when not many people have done it at all. Why don't people explore this world more often?
Well, I think I was having thinking about it earlier. The Damned United was the only one, but I mean it's kind of quasi-fictional. I mean, it's a retelling of real events with very obvious fictional overtones and stuff, and it's inside the mind of this Brian Clough character. But yeah, I'm trying to think of one that's just a straight up.
Well, there's the Arsenal one that was made into a movie. Yeah, there was the Arsenal Stadium Mystery. Is that what it was called? I'm pretty sure it was based on a book and was made into a movie. So there are one or two knocking around all right, but they don't seem to have broken into our consciousness.
I think to some extent it might be that they're just non-overlapping magisteria, that it's a little bit like why they can't really nail down a perfect football movie or that, because thinking boxing maybe lends itself more to it. You think of great sport films and football is not really covered very well, possibly because it's just so hard to translate the energy of such a complex game into actors doing that thing. It's harder to do and look cool in slow motion. I mean, I don't know, and that's something where you've got all the tips and tricks of cinematography to make everything look amazing. If you're trying to describe it on the page, then you'd have to be Ernest Hemingway describing a bullfight in order to make it leap off the page. Maybe it doesn't actually work too well from a dramatic point of view. And I think these books kind of prove that, really. Steve Bruce avoids talking about football as much as he can. There's about, in total, between the three books, maybe 20 pages that even really mention football matches. The rest of it is just your straightforward murder mystery, kidnappings, hostages, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, the straightforward stuff. Well, listen, Seamus O'Reilly, I would normally ask where people could go and get these books, but it sounds like you've got about the only copy of each of them, so maybe they contact you directly or something.
That's right, and the third book fell into my paw there yesterday, so when we've got a review for that'll be up on the setpieces.com. So that's where they can at least get a little bit. If they bump into me, then I can show it to them.
Exactly, yeah, you carry all three around with you at all time. Listen, Seamus, brilliant, thanks for talking to us.
No worries, thanks again.